Anyway, welcome to week 4. I mean, it's hard to believe that it's gone by this quickly. Now, for those of you who are asking, yes, week 1, week 2, and week 3 are available online, and the PowerPoint presentations, both in PDF form and PowerPoint form, are now all online. Yay! Finally. So we're kind of getting into the groove of this, and I think once this is all done, I may go back and revise those lessons to expand some of the material, so that if people can just simply come in, browse, and listen. But certainly a special thank you to Shannon and Lonnie of providing, making sure that the video part of this actually happens, because I think the feedback is, I hope you get a lot out of this. So, shining a light on the Dark Ages. Of course, where we've been, and talking about evolution and migration. The thing is, really, for this, I hope most of this seminar has been about the evolution of the church, and the evolution of Christianity, and this is just dealing with another facet on it, and really this is covering it. Unfortunately, this is as much of what do I keep in and what do I leave out. And the thing is, when we talk about the Dark Ages, I mean, the Dark Ages is really not a great description, but it's what we're working with. And of course, that's today. And then next week is the West versus East. Remember how when we started this whole thing, the very first thing I described to you was this split in 1054 CE. And that split, we're getting there. We're leading up to it. And you're hopefully going to be able to get a couple of, even a couple of insights, even tonight, as to where that split is becoming more and more obvious. That by the time we get to the end of next week, we'll have the split completely in place, but also the groundwork for the First Crusade will also be in place. And some of that even we're covering tonight. So, Christianity after the fall of Rome, and I am not getting a good reception here. Let me see if I can improve this, because this is cutting out a lot more than I like it to. I'm going to work this on the outside. All right, I'm going to try it this way. The pack needs a direct line of sight. Sometimes it cuts in, sometimes it cuts out. I've been cutting out more than I like. Anyway, Christianity after the fall, and specifically what I'm talking here is the fall of Rome. The trouble is, we probably put a lot more, too much emphasis on the sack of Rome in 410, because the Roman Empire itself lived along until about 476. The trouble is, Rome had long ceased to be the capital of the Roman Empire. I mean, it was called the Roman Empire, but really, the places of governance, remember from last week, is that in fact the Western Empire was, at least for a time, governed from Milan. And more specifically, during this time, it was in Ravenna, in northeast Italy, not far from Venice, if I remember geography correctly. But here is that, of course, when Alaric sacked Rome in 410, it was more of a rebellion than it was actually an external invasion. I mean, that's one of the things. These were people who were all part of what was called the Federati, but they were part of the Germanic tribes who had moved into the Roman Empire and wanted to partake in it, but weren't given a say. Broad overview here. And not dissimilar is when Odoacer deposed the last Roman emperor. This was a case of again someone from within, as opposed to an external invasion. Now, in this case, unlike what had happened before, when the last Roman emperor in the West was deposed, he went off into exile. And one of the reasons why we sometimes call this the Dark Ages is his trail goes dark. We don't know what happened to him at all. We don't know if he was in prison. We don't know when he died. That was it. But he himself, Odoacer was an Arian Christian, and most of the area at this point in time had become Christianized. But of course, one of the reasons, again, Dark Ages, is because just simply it's becoming more and more difficult. There's less and less primary sources to rely on, and the secondary sources that we have in terms of describing the period are certainly written from certain points of view. And so this is sort of the time that you could say that the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages started. This was about that time. And of course, when Rome collapsed, civil society went with it. Now, the trouble is this is way too small to read. I needed to always double check that. Is that what you had was a number of local rulers and local kingdoms that, certainly in the West, began to rise. But also, because of the collapse of the civil government, there was this void in power in many respects, that the church was the only organizations that actually had a communications infrastructure and an ability to respond, to at least provide some degree of stability. This comes up again, and we'll be coming back to this a little bit more. As per usual, questions, stick up your hand at any time, and I'll do my best to answer your question. Now, here's a map. So,
when did there start to be a head of the Christian church?
Well, there's.
What happened to, assuming that was Rome, what happened to it afterwards?
Well, in this case, the head of the Christian church was often assigned as the bishop of Rome. Is gained the title of the El Papa, of course, is one term, but I mean that's where Pope came to place. There were bishops all over the place, but a unique authority was extended, at least in the Western Church, to the bishop in Rome. And actually, we are getting to that to a certain degree. That the papacy, as we know it today, this is more or less where it's getting in place. Now, there were popes all along in terms of those who were bishops of Rome from the earliest days of the church existed, and as a matter of respect, they were regarded as the bishop of Rome because, of course, legends had it that Peter himself was the first bishop of Rome. Now, good argument that Phoebe was, but that's another. That's more of another point. But we get to why was Rome becoming a powerful center of the church, and that's actually one of the things that we actually cover today. So hopefully, when I get to that, I'll bring that back up. But certainly by this time, the father in Rome, the Pope. I mean, that's ultimately where that is the, I mean, even today, Francis I is the Bishop of Rome. But because of the type of power that the Vatican wields, and in terms of he's also now the perceived head of the church.
As far as the Christianity goes in non-Roman areas, did they have a link to Rome?
Well, I will be getting to that. That is actually one of the reasons why this is my preamble, and then we are definitely getting into that tonight. So this just gives you an idea that this was the area that Odoacer controlled. But notice, all of a sudden, you have this breakup of a number of different tribes, and this is about roughly in the 480 in terms of the fall of Rome. But you also had the Eastern Roman Empire and a number of others. But this kind of gives you an idea of where things were at the point at which Odoacer became king of Italy. And all he wanted was Italy. But there still is this title over here, Roman Empire. And of course, these smaller communities become much more important. This is happening in the West. And of course, at this point in time, this is where you see the ones who went out into the desert began to form communities. And monasteries became far more important in this. Because, of course, the one thing that didn't, that even though Roman governance collapsed, the ecclesiastical structure remained in place. And so the one thing that the church in the West, all of a sudden, there was no one governing body that that the Western Church was under, because you had the kingdom of Italy, but there was also the areas that Rome was responsible for was also further out into Spain, up into what we now know as Great Britain, and certainly up amongst these tribes that were multiple. There were multiple kingdoms, and of course even south along the northern shore of Africa, or the southern shore of the Mediterranean, northern coast of Africa. And so as a result, the Western Church actually remained largely independent of a dominating political force. And that was one big difference. It actually allowed the church to become, the Western Church to become effectively transnational organization. And that was one of the big things. And this is one of the things in terms of history that, we're going to take all this and then we're going to compare it to elsewhere. And of course, this is going back to, sorry, your name is Tim? Yeah, sorry, Tim. This is where of course, the modern papacy began to evolve, even though the term pope had been used before this. The power of the papacy began really to start growing at this point. Also,
is it also this point that the concept of speaking ex cathedra came up?
Not yet. In terms of that one's a little bit more fuzzy. I'm going to have to look at exact date, but the speaking ex cathedra, or however it's pronounced, in terms of the Pope is providing an infallible statement. They didn't quite have that authority at this point in time. They wanted it. They didn't quite have it. But you're going to see how eventually that eventually evolves. And of course, Lonnie, before I move on.
You mentioned there's lots of bishops, but one bishop of Rome.
Yes.
Would they have referred to him as the archbishop?
Not exactly. I mean, even though people who were archbishop, like in the hierarchy, people who were archbishops over several smaller areas, what were called dioceses, that you see the structure was still evolving, and archbishop certainly as a term existed, but curiously enough, archbishops still deferred to the Bishop of Rome in terms of overall power. And hence you get Pope, Archbishop, archbishops, bishops working down. Somewhere there are cardinals, however they fit into the mix. But many cardinals themselves functionally are archbishops. But for those of you who are Roman Catholic, you know that hierarchy better than I do. So anyway, the knowledge, of course, from the Greco-Roman period did continue. You see, the Roman Empire itself, today we live in a day where 99% of the population is literate. Okay? I'm assuming all of you can read, otherwise I'm wasting my time with this. Okay? In the highest instances in the Roman Empire, literacy is estimated to be around, at best, 20%. And I'm not sure if Peggy, if you have any other information and knowledge about that. I mean, it was largely in the, literacy existed largely in the elite class. Regular city dwellers, regular farmers, sort of Joe and Jane average. Literacy was not really a priority. Certainly amongst the elite classes it was. Of course, when the Roman Empire, in the Western Roman Empire collapsed, so did literacy. It went down. And so at best, roughly 6% of the population was functionally literate. And most of them were in the church hierarchy. Not all of them, but most of them. And certainly places where you went to learn in terms of literacy was, in many respects, if you wanted to be literate, you went to a monastery. But the thing is, it was mostly the church, but not exclusively the church. And I think that's one thing is you might have heard the stereotype that it was only the church that actually was literate. It's kind of like, that's not quite true. But that's where a lot of it happened. Melania, saw your hand.
Is there a standard for literacy? Like, if you could read a little bit, then you're literate, or you could read the entire Bible cover to cover?
That's a great question. I think honestly, I'm not sure what these ratings are, but certainly would be above a current grade 3 education. Probably need to be higher than that. Just functionally being able to read, and the broad definition I think is just being able to read and write. More than just simply kind of a couple words here and there, like being able to sit down and read and copy a book would probably be a good sort of guideline. And of course, this rate would remain where it was until the dawn of the Renaissance, nearly almost 1,000 years after this. So.
Does it help to know that Constantine, who was that from the top guy outside Rome, right, could read, but he couldn't write?
So there you go. Sorry, what Peggy pointed out is that Constantine the Great could read, but he could not write. So he would be considered literate in terms of being able to read, but he was not able to communicate his own ideas. He'd have to pay somebody else to write it down for him. So, and that probably wasn't uncommon. I mean, we know that Paul himself could read and write, which was actually very rare for the day. Unusually rare. But I mean, at the same time, that was also part of the culture, being trained as a Pharisee. But there's an example in Galatians, for example, that normally when Paul wrote his letters, he didn't actually write them himself. He actually was dictating them to someone else who could write for him. Because his penmanship probably wasn't all that big. But at one point, he's so annoyed with the Galatians that he rips the pen out of the guy's hand and said, "Now this is what I'm," in big block letters. And it's the equivalent of texting yelling at the Galatians for it. But if you look carefully, somewhere towards the end of it, it says, "See what large letters I make." That's an example of him actually doing it in writing. But generally, for the most part, penmanship was a real skill. I mean, for those of you who took the Dead Sea Scrolls, the fact that they were actually able to write multiple lines on a piece of paper this big, it's stunning in terms of that level of skill. And that level of skill and training you found in monasteries. If you've seen these illuminated texts of people writing these lovely drawings around there, honestly, they were just doodling. Very pretty doodling, but it was doodling. Anyway, that's an aside. But here's the hitch. The Roman Empire didn't actually fall. The Western Roman Empire fell. And this is where we need to get away from our own Eurocentric kind of thinking. Is that we talk about the fall of the Roman Empire. The Western Empire fell, but the Eastern Empire did not. And in fact, the Eastern Empire existed in one way, shape, or form until 1453. The Eastern Roman Empire existed up until basically the dawn, right in through the Renaissance. The Ottoman Turks are the ones that officially brought the Eastern Roman Empire down. And they understood themselves as that way. We refer to this empire of the Eastern Empire as, if you've heard the term, the Byzantine Empire. Byzantine Empire, Eastern Roman Empire, the Roman Empire, same thing. Because, of course, people in it understood themselves to be as a direct continuation of the Roman Empire. I mean, keep in mind that Constantine's capital was Constantinople. And this is remained the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. I am going to use the term Byzantine Empire just to make it a little more clear. But they saw themselves as Romans.
Did they still have a Caesar, emperor?
Yes.
A Roman?
Yeah. They perceived themselves as they absolutely did perceive themselves, and there were a line of emperors right on up to here. Okay. Now the trouble is the border and the size of that went all the way through, and you're going to see some of that. Because of course Constantinople was actually founded on an old Greek colony called Byzantium. And that's why it's called the Byzantine Empire. Although it's funny, Byzantium is a very Latin sounding name, but anyway, that Constantinople was founded, and that became the capital of the Eastern of the entire Roman Empire for much of it. And of course, we know that Nicene Christianity was the official religion of the Roman Empire. Theodosius lived in the Eastern Empire. So, Lonnie, I saw another hand.
No, rub my face.
Okay, you're good. Okay. Or did I see any other hands? Okay, the thing is, this is a little blue thing, and sometimes it blurs my vision as I'm waving around. And of course, the Western Church, of course, being based out of Rome, the dominant language, the training language was Latin. But here's the thing, the New Testament is written in Greek. Much of the rites developed by the church were actually Greek-based rites. If you want to see how the church, if you want to know where can I go to see what the church, the earliest church looked like in its worship, you are more likely to get that picture by going to an Eastern, specifically Greek Orthodox church. And the Eastern Church continued to use the language of the East, namely Greek. Now, administratively, the Roman Empire did use Latin, but at a certain point, they just say, okay, let's drop the pretenses, and they went back. They kept Greek administratively. The church largely stayed. The church in the East largely stayed Greek. Now, here's the thing. Remember how I said when the Western Empire collapsed, the Western Church, centered out of Rome, didn't have one particular body with its thumb on it. The Eastern Empire did. And that's a very important distinction. That is one of the reasons why, in the truest sense, there is not actually an Eastern Orthodox Pope. There's a term used to describe the different Eastern Orthodox churches that exist today. They're called autocephalous. And basically, the various Orthodox churches themselves are functionally independent from each other, but they like to get together every once in a while and chat. Probably best distinction. Although that description, these so-called autocephalies, I mean, the Russian Orthodox Church is one, the Greek Orthodox Church is the other, Syrian Orthodox Church, Serbian Orthodox Church. All of these ones are what are called autocephalies. The trouble is, each of that, we don't even get to that point in this course. But there is no equivalent of a pope in the Eastern Church. So
Western Christians or Catholics would accept and follow the dictates coming out of Constantinople?
At this point, yes. Not without some chafing. Okay? Not without some chafing. But you see, even though the Western Church structurally existed outside of this, they were still linked to the, at this point you can refer to the Church as the Great Church. They were still linked to what was happening in Constantinople as well. And of course, the structure of the Roman Empire as it existed and as it developed and changed directly impacted the structure of the church as we know it today. Okay. If it was not for what was going on politically with the Roman Empire, we would not have a Roman Catholic Church and an Eastern Orthodox Church. At this point in time, I mean, the term Catholic means universal. And usually when someone describes themselves to me as Catholic, I hear translate Roman Catholic, specifically because Catholic has become shorthand. But really, functionally, if you're part of a church that follows the Nicene Creed, including this one, you're technically Catholic because it's small c. I did hear the small c Catholic, but yes, you are technically small c Catholic in terms of universal church. But anyway, that's my little semi-sermonette there. Okay, so where are we here? But here's where things started to happen. And actually, Tim, this is directly getting to your question. See, Justinian I managed to actually reclaim a whole lot of territory that were lost to the migration, specifically the Visigoths. And he was able to I'm going to show him a map in a couple of slides, but he was able to actually reunify the empire to a certain extent, and Rome was reclaimed after Odoacer. The Ostrogoths then took over the kingdom of Italy, and Justinian was actually able to do a campaign to recover that territory. And so the trouble is the dark lines aren't working all that well. I'm going to go over here. And so there's Rome, there's Italy, and this, of course, at one point was part of the Roman Empire, but it never, ever came back into official Roman hands. But this kind of gives you an idea that this is the largest that the Byzantine Empire ever got. Although really the Byzantine Empire was simply the Eastern Roman Empire actually managed to expand to this in 555. And a lot was reclaimed, but there was a lot left over. And the thing is, the Western Church had churches all through here that were still outside of that political control. This is, again, one of these rabbit holes you can get down into. If you've ever heard of the Justinian Code, early, in many respects, early laws, that a lot of it was developed by the Eastern Empire. And in one of his, one of the novella novels, New Writing, proposed a structure for a new structure for the church. And it was actually formalizing something that actually, in many respects, had already existed, but it was called a pentarchy. And the idea that the church was to be divided into 5 districts, centered out of Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. And they were called sees. Have you ever heard of the Vatican being referred to as the Holy See? Well, that kind of comes out of that. In many respects, of course, they did eventually become formalized at this point in time. Although, interestingly, by the time it was actually formalized, when we get into stuff happening later tonight, it might have been formalized, but in many respects, it had already fallen apart by the time that it had been formalized. That's one of my points not on the slides. Because, of course, Rome wanted to be understood as the first among equals. We're all brothers, but I'm the best brother. St. Peter was here, so we're kind of above you guys. And so that tension was there. You know what? I need to readjust the contrast on this because that's washing it out. So let me just give me, where's my menu? Because there we go. Now we're starting to get some color back into this. Okay, there we go. Feet still work. So this gives you an idea in terms of colors of what the Petrarchy looked like. Over here, off the map, is Rome. Rome is about there. And Rome, at least up until this point, has the authority here. This changes eventually. Then you have the one centered out of Constantinople, Antioch, Jerusalem, and then Alexandria, in terms of church organization. And basically, those different centers, they come together and communicate every once in a while, but usually it was Rome and everybody else. Hence, tensions. Part 2 is next week, by the way. So, you see, because the Roman Church existed under really what was an unstable political environment, without being subject to an imperial power, they had a lot more freedom. In fact, eventually, they began to actually exert authority over the states in which they had churches. That didn't really happen in the period that we're talking about today, but eventually they move in that direction. Of course, everything else at this point in time was under Byzantine rule and, of course, kept on a tight leash. I'm forgetting your name, but going back to the church history is sometimes like making sausage.
Yes.
Sorry, your name again, please?
Yeah.
So we were conversing a little bit in terms of this, is that if you notice when church councils were actually called, they were actually called by Byzantine emperors, kind of saying, you guys need to sort this out. You're starting with Constantine. And then, particularly in the Eastern Church, not so much in the West, but the Eastern Church, they started having just these councils every once in a while. But all of them were called by the emperors. Not by church leaders saying, hey, we need to sort this out. It was more like, no, you guys need to figure it out because I need a cohesive religion in order to legitimate, to give me legitimacy in my rule.
But I think, though, that the emperors imposed their will on the councils.
Oh, they did.
So it's not, you guys figure it out. You figure it out the way I want it.
Yeah, and hence there's the tight leash. But you see, by this point, Rome is Rome themselves. The church centered out of Rome is becoming more and more and more independent. And sometimes these councils in the East happened without any participation at all from the Western Church. And so that became more and more an issue. And so this is just this is more just stating what I've just said. But curiously enough, the Council of this is again going a little early. But the Council of Chalcedon, this was a case where there were a church that wasn't happy with how that particular council went. And this is where, if you've heard of the Coptic Orthodox Church, they were officially a non-Chalcedonian, and they still exist today. But the Coptic Church exists in Egypt. It still exists today in modern-day Egypt. And you see, a lot of these councils happened, but you see, the further away you were from the center of the Byzantine power, the less involved in these councils and the more excluded you might have felt. And this actually does have an impact a little later on tonight that happens. But these various councils that are going on are trying to resolve exactly as the empire felt. And there were some, for example, in the Persian Empire, the Christian church that existed there, Christians were seen as basically extensions of the Byzantine Empire. The Persians weren't too keen on that. So the Persian church, I'll get to, there's this slide coming up, I'm getting ahead of myself. But the church in Persia declared independence from the Byzantine church because they were being persecuted under the Persians for actually colluding with the enemy.
Were the Coptics in Persia?
No, the Copts were in Egypt. In Egypt.
And how's Coptic Christianity? How's that different?
If you were to go to a Coptic worship service, a lot of it these days is actually either most Coptic Christians speak Arabic, for example. There's actually a great big Coptic church out in Balzac, just west of, east of Crosshammer Mills. So it still does exist, but they were largely this was a church largely centered in Egypt and points south. So I don't know if that I don't think answers your question.
So from a religion point of view,
Theologically, they would be considered Nicene Christians, but non-Chalcedonian Christians. In other words, they would accept the Nicene Creed, and that's sort of the overarching thing for me is that you can consider yourself Christian if you ascribe to the Nicene Creed, because that really was that core confession of what we believe in the aftermath of the various heresies that arose. And everything after that, from my perspective, is almost like angels on the head of a pin. Gross oversimplification, but Coptic Christians, at this point in time, we were starting to get into doctrinal discussions that were becoming more and more micromanaging at the time. And that was more representative of the imperial, in many respects, the imperial control. But it was a big deal. Certainly at the time, it really was a big deal, because for them, it was the arguing of the nature of reality. You know.
I lost with the Nicene Creed.
Sorry, the Nicene Creed was created at in the first council of Nicaea, called by Emperor Constantine in 325 CE. Adopted in the East and the West, and is still used today, and is recognized as probably the universal creed amongst Christians. I mean, in the Western Church, we tend to use the Apostles' Creed, and of course here in the United Church, we've got one that's called a new creed. But for example, as the United Church, we still ascribe and still print Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed. You pick up our worship book, the creeds are right there.
Of the 5 different seas, then, the Alexandrian Sea became Coptic?
Not exactly.
So,
But sort of. But the thing is, there was sort of the further you went south, the more likely you were to find Coptic. But yeah, I mean the thing is, something else happened that really made that point moot. We get to that. And you see, the thing is, every time they did a council, there was always somebody else left out. So you have other groups, Arians, Nestorians, Monophysites. The list actually is really quite big. And you see, the concept of, and I was saying this earlier, is that when someone was declared heresy or outside the church, such as Nestorians and in many respects Arians, the whole concept of burning a heretic didn't actually happen until 1022 for the first time. Generally, they were simply excluded, but they still continued their practice. And these practices often went places south and east of the Byzantine Empire, and this would come back later. So you know, as they felt increasingly left out. I mean, even though these councils were intended to unify, they were unifying specifically under the Byzantine Empire. As I mentioned before, being Christian underneath the hierarchy that was established out of Constantinople was becoming more and more a liability issue for Christians, especially those who lived and practiced and worshipped in places that were actually enemies of the Byzantine Empire.
It might help confuse people further, but it might explain how complicated it was to remember that some bishops actually raised their own armies.
Yes. To add to the confusion is that some bishops did actually raise their own armies. And in many respects, the whole concept of celibacy, you actually had bishops who were hereditary. Okay? Celibacy didn't come till later. And that was actually largely a production of the Western Church, not the Eastern Church. And of course, the further away you got from the center. So I've been talking about this before. The less and less orthodox they became. In this case, you know, then what do we do with power? You see, the Western Church was starting to be able to exercise influence, diplomacy, and eventually overt pressure on various nations, various kingdoms, and whereas in the Byzantine Church, it was always subject to the whims of the emperor. But it was in the emperor's interest to have a cohesive religious system in place. So that became more and more an issue. So you have the West having a great deal of autonomy and independence, and in the East, it really became more subject to rule at the time. But of course, you've ever heard the term Byzantine politics? Okay, guess where it comes from? And again, this is a very deep rabbit hole. Just by virtue of even the name itself says to you how deep the rabbit hole actually is. So, one of the things that was happening along this time is that the Sassanid Empire, which we've not talked about at all, it's like all of a sudden, poof, here's another empire to deal with. The Sassanid Empire was actually really what the empire that was in Persia, and they were the chief rivals of the Byzantine Empire. And they fought back and forth, they struggled for power. But of course, there were Christians that lived all throughout the Sassanid Empire, which was actually Zoroastrian, by the way. And so, even as early as 424, the Persian Church, of course, had declared itself independent of the Byzantine Church. But Christians were still viewed by Persians, by the Sassanids, as being suffering. And so that was always a tension. But of course, because these two empires were vying for control, they weakened each other and allowed something else to happen. So there's, right at the beginning of this now critically important period, we're talking the beginning of the 7th century, you have the Byzantine Empire, you have the Persian Empire under the Sassanids, but you also have these two empires, as big as they are weak, very weak. And then something happens down here. That's the Arabian Peninsula. Boom. Now the thing is, I'm going to start this by describing it not from what happened in the Arabian Peninsula, but the perspective of the people in both the Sassanid and the Byzantine Empire. Is right in the middle of the 7th century, all of a sudden this wave comes right out of the Arabian Peninsula. They have no idea what's going on. The Sassanid Empire is destroyed. It ceases to exist as a political entity. And you see, all of a sudden it just seemed to be started of these Arabic tribes coming out and raiding, but there was something greater behind it. And this energized Arabian population was energized under the banner of someone claiming to be a prophet by the name of Muhammad. But you see, by this time, Muhammad was already dead. And I'm going to go back and cover that. By the way, for those of you who can read Arabic, I can't, but Arabic is actually very similar to Hebrew. But that's Muhammad in Arabic. And you see, traditional tribal culture was very much polytheistic. But this particular movement, when it came out, they actually had a fairly cohesive belief structure, a way of being, but also they claimed a connection with a lot of things out of both the Hebrew Bible and Christianity. But it was very different from Nicene Christianity. Remember how I said the further you got away from the core of the empire, the more people had freedom to express their thoughts. Well, the ones that went south and east had a great impact on the development of this new faith. And hence Islam of course, remember, from the perspective of the Byzantine Empire, this just kind of exploded. The reality is that the Arab tribes had united under Muhammad between 622 and 632. Islam means submission, total submission to God. And again, prior to Muhammad, these tribes had largely been polytheistic, although it's thought that Muhammad himself was actually part of a tribe that was actually monotheistic and claimed a lineage from the stories of, one of the reasons why Islam is called an Abrahamic faith is because this Hanif was people who claimed to be the descendants of Ishmael, the son of Abraham and Hagar, as described in the early part of Genesis, saying that you will also have a great nation. That there were people who understood this, and it is thought that Muhammad himself was actually, even before his experience, his revelation of having as described as the angel Gabriel speaking to him, hence becoming a prophet, is that he himself was actually monotheistic already. But he was able to unify the tribes in through the Arabian Peninsula. And these were largely nomadic people, but they had all been largely decimated by the war between the Byzantine Empire and the Sassanids. They weren't too happy with either of them. And of course, with the Byzantines and the Byzantine Empire and the Sassanid Empire both being substantially weakened, when Muhammad unified the Arab tribes, there was a vacuum. And that's usually when you see rapid expansion of any empire in history, it's because there's a vacuum. There's nobody in that space. Someone steps in. And so the Arab tribes, in this case, stepped into that vacuum. And then Muhammad died in approximately 632, and the term caliphate. A caliph is a steward, by the way. That just making sure that the Rashidun Caliphate, they, at this point in time, under Muhammad, the Arabian Peninsula was united. And then, after Muhammad's death, that's when the expansions began. And under the Rashidun Caliphate, the Sassanid Empire collapsed. And so that territory went to this new, this period is sometimes referred to as the Arab conquest. And while yes, there was some combat involved, most of it is when they moved into these areas. These areas were so depleted that they just, again, power vacuum. We just move in and occupy. But here's the thing: when they occupied these places, the Muslims at this point in time, they lowered taxes, they gave additional religious freedom to Christians and Jews living in the area. And of course, these were areas, all of the areas that they moved into were areas in which they were already in some degree of dispute with the Byzantine Church. And this was an opportunity to throw that off. And while many Christians did maintain their identity underneath Islam, at the same time, it was very, very appealing because the message of Islam was very simple, and so it was seen as a really good and very strong alternative. So here's how in a very short period of time, Islam expanded. Okay, notice I've just kind of, I've got another map coming up as well. But you have, this area is the area that, now, the borders here that you see are modern day borders, just so you get a frame of reference. These did not exist at the time. And some of these, even the spellings on some of these maps is not quite right. It's what you pull off the internet. You know, I need a quick visual. But basically, Muhammad unified the tribes in Egypt over a 10-year period. And then the Rashidun Caliphate, over the next 30 years, expanded out this way. So, what is now Iraq and Iran, that was the Sassanid Empire. Gone. And then you saw this expansion, basically all this area. And then under the Umayyad dynasty, up to about 750, you saw this expansion here and all the way up into Spain. And this was the largest, in terms of that, that's as big as they got. Still enormous. And, you know, it exploded out of, but from the perspective of the Byzantines, they came out of nowhere. Really, there was a development, there was a reason why it came in, but from the perspective of the Byzantines, it came out of nowhere.
Another article for you. Are these, okay, so we've got Christianity sort of in the north, and Islam down here. But are there still a lot or many other polytheistic religions?
Well,
I mean, I know we go further north, and still got the Vikings and you know, so I'm just, how, I guess I don't know, there's the line.
where's the line in terms of saying, so Bonnie's question has to do with, at this point in time, where there are different polytheistic religions? Well, and truth be told, many of them still exist today. Hindu, out here, okay. You know, you actually have this line. This is where Islam comes in contact with Hinduism.
Well, I'm thinking more about, like, we're talking about the Arabs, like the
Yes.
Those are probably, so did they all descend of Olivo, or did we have pockets of Bedouins, the travelers?
Well, generally, most converted most converted to Islam. But you see, you know, the stories, the 1001 Arabian Nights, the stories of genies and things like that. It all came out of here. But that's representative of that polytheistic culture. And generally, the Muslims were seen as actually fairly benevolent rulers. I mean, unless of course you were here or here, then it wasn't so good. And because these were certainly points of conflict, and I can't speak for over here either. But in terms of this expansion, you see how quickly this is. You know, this is basically over a period of 100 years. Boom.
Was Muhammad a territorial leader as well as a religious leader?
He was a merchant originally, but yes, eventually he was always, from what I understand, like he was age 40, so not much younger than I am, when he began. The stories say that he began having visions, but it wasn't. But the thing is, he was. This came probably in about probably 6, even as much as 10 years before this, that he started to unify. That he did become initially a merchant, but he did eventually become a territorial leader as well. So this was one and the same. I mean, it wasn't. You had the religion, but you also, but it was also the religion, but it was also under unifying really what were divided tribes. And so this was both a religious and a political. They were tied. They were intrinsically tied together.
And did the caliphs then have the same
Oh, that's a great question and a very, very deep rabbit hole. See, Muhammad himself was succeeded under a Arabic tribal tradition of agreed that was agreed upon. However, there was also a faction very early on that said, no, we need to follow the one that Muhammad himself designated, not the one that the council came up with. And that's where you get that initial split between Sunni and Shia Muslims. It would eventually take a little while for that to split, to be realized. And of course, today, most Shia Muslims occupy this area of the world. And Sunni Muslims, now, and the trouble is, it's not even within each of those, there's many in the same way the Christians have lots of different denominations. Islam is not one big monolithic group at all. So it's kind of a little interesting. That's a whole other story of itself. And in that case, I would actually defer to the Imam of the mosque over here to give that history. Might even try and make that arrangement. That might be kind of fun. But of course, Islam stepped right into a vacuum, and of course, not only did the Byzantine Empire have to deal with this sudden rise of Islam, because they were devoting as much resources as they were. There was also what was going on that the various Germanic kingdoms were reasserting their control as well. And so, oh yeah, and not only that, there was actually a time in the empire that nobody knew who was ruling who. It was called the 20 Years' Anarchy. So remember that great big map that I showed, the extent of how much territory Justinian the First, Justinian the Great, controlled? Well, the thing is, the Umayyad dynasty spread across North Africa and of course up into Spain. Suddenly, the Byzantine Empire looked like this. Not really an empire, that's more like Turkey and a few other places. Because, even here, you had pockets. Like Rome was still nominally under Byzantine control at this point in time. But notice, of the Petrarchy, Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria, 3 of those centers of Christianity are now fully under Islamic control. And needless to say, free trade agreements and safe passage agreements didn't exist at this time. So they were lost. They were seen as lost, even though Christians still existed and actually flourished in many respects under Islam. At least as far as Constantinople, as far as these 2 centers now, which is what we're left with, saw they were lost. Truth is, they weren't lost. They weren't lost at all. And in fact, some aspects, particularly Nestorian Christians and others, actually had a great deal to do with one of the reasons why this early period of Islam was considered to be a real golden age. This is where centers of learning and all kinds of things that knowledge was treasured, literacy was treasured at this point in time. And of course, that one I've already covered in the map. And of course, the Christians, I've talked about this point already. But curiously enough, a lot of those ideas, some of the ones that were left out of the Council of Chalcedon and earlier, if you ever ask a Muslim who Jesus is, they refer to Jesus as a prophet. But here's the other thing is that they don't accept that he was crucified, because that would be unseemly for a prophet. Now that's actually echoing some of the thoughts of early Christians that were considered to be heretics who moved out of sort of out of the influence of both the Rome and the Western Church. So there were lots of people talking about Jesus, but these are the people that Muhammad came in contact with.
So they just didn't like the idea that he was crucified and decided that it just didn't happen, or?
Well, again, this is going all the way back to those Gnostic heresies I'm telling you about. There were, like, first off, Gnostics didn't like the idea that Jesus actually was flesh and blood. They thought he was an image. Now, Islam accepts that he was flesh and blood, but in fact it was somebody else crucified in his place. Is what they'll argue. Because, well, I mean, the whole point is crucifixion as a Roman, that was reserved for the lowest of the low, and so it was one of the reasons why Christianity has had a hard time taking hold in Japan, for example, is that the nature of the death, the scandalous nature of how Jesus died. But you see, there were also some early Christians. The trouble is, if I were to give you a complete list of all the different heresies, we'd be here just for 5 sessions just on those alone. But there's one called Doceticism, which is basically Jesus simply appeared human, but wasn't, and so he appeared, but wasn't actually there. And so some of these elements are influenced by that. But we suddenly realized that, in fact, Christianity was suddenly a whole lot more diverse than we realized. Out of these, really, what was trying to be that was under the really imperial rule under the Byzantines, or had enough of that influence that was still in place, but then began to, in essence, have their own degree of power. Now, snapping all the way back into the Byzantine Empire. Have you ever heard the term iconoclast? What is an iconoclast, at least as you understand it? Someone who breaks an icon. I mean that is literally iconoclasm. It is breaking an icon. This was actually a movement that arose in the 8th century. Because as these great big as these losses happened, instead of it turning to an external threat, they began to interpret this as a loss of divine favor. Here's the other thing, is that, of course, people from this period of time do not discount the impact of natural disasters on the psyche of a people. I actually made an argument that one of the reasons why piracy in the Caribbean ended was not because of any policy established by the Spaniards or by the British or by the French or by the Dutch. They had passed all kinds of laws against it. But when an earthquake happened that literally sunk Port Royal in Jamaica, like dropped it underneath the ocean, piracy ended within 30 years. People took it as a sign, and this Port Royal was considered to be the wickedest city in Christendom. It was called that. And then all of a sudden we have this act of God wiping the city from the map, kind of like Sodom and Gomorrah. People thought, well, maybe piracy is not such a good idea anymore. That's a fun little aside. But here, there was actually a volcanic eruption near, the island was called Thera. These days it's called Santorini. And apparently, somewhere around 1600 BC, there was like a Krakatoa-sized eruption that wiped out a lot of people. Apparently, there was an underwater volcanic eruption in 726 that actually created a tsunami that wreaked havoc across the Aegean and centered around centered, of course, this was all in the Byzantine Empire. Losses were substantial. And so, great big tidal wave comes in, combined with the loss of territory. the perception was somehow we got on God's bad side. And so, as a way to solve this, they started doing a lot of soul searching. Because keep in mind, not as an informed as educated as the leaders might have been, they did not have the big picture. I mean, this human wave comes out of Arabia, wipes out an empire. They're barely holding on. And so, specifically, it was Emperor Leo III that was convinced that, and many people agreed with him, that we've done something wrong. And they began to search around and they said, you know what? In the Ten Commandments, you shall not make a graven image. Commandment number 2, they thought, well, that's the first place they went and realized, oh, maybe that's not such a good idea. And there was what called iconoclasm, which was because up until this point, there had actually developed a fairly strong tradition in both the Western and the Eastern Empire of effectively worshiping or at least praying to representations of the saints. Icons. Representations of Jesus, representations of the Virgin Mary, representations of, Saint What's-His-Face down the street. It developed with that. And so there developed this movement of saying, and Pope Leo just said, this is it. And there may have been some Islamic influence as well, because Islamic culture was very much against the depiction of anything in like in art. The word was the primary thing. So there might have been some of that influence in saying, well, they don't have images, they must be following that. So how much influence there is some historical debate. So we're not entirely sure. So, but that could have been an influence. But certainly that whole Second Commandment thing was certainly in place. And Leo decided about 4 years after this volcanic eruption to ban icons in the church. Now, here's the thing: the Western Church said, "No, icons aren't the problem. They're not the problem." And so the Western Church never participated in this, even though technically they were under the West. They were kind of under Byzantine rule, but not really. So they actually had, particularly in the areas not controlled by the Byzantine Empire, icons just continued, and the veneration of saints. You see, the worry was that the veneration of saints had become too much like worship. You worship God and God alone, not the icons. You thought that only came up during the Reformation. No, it came up much earlier than that. Lonnie, did I see a hand?
I am curious about something, but I wasn't going to ask it.
Okay.
So, is that an icon in the corner?
That would be considered an icon, yes.
Okay.
In some respects. This actually, just a little bit of history. This actually belongs to my predecessor. It's not actually owned by the church. It's actually owned by the Reverend Clint Moody, my predecessor, who, had it put up. And like I said, it's actually quite unusual for a United Church to actually have what effectively is a crucifix, as opposed to a cross. Crucifix is a cross with Jesus hanging on it. And this is sort of, it's a semi-crucifix because Jesus isn't quite hanging on it. But in some respects, yes. But also stained glass windows would be considered icons as well. Generally, coming from a Protestant tradition, Protestants were actually quite iconoclastic, almost 1,000 years later, in terms of not being so keen on that. Like, very first church I ever worked at was in Cornwall, and somebody had donated to them a brass cross about this big that had in homicidal this symbol here. emblazoned on it, in Hominem Salvatore, or anyway, I'll get into that later if you want. Because I'm getting tongue tied, I can't pronounce it tonight. And there was a debate several times over in this session as to whether or not they would actually put it on their communion table. And there was arguments, and I'm talking, this was, in my lifetime. This is, it didn't happen while I was there, but it happened a few years before. That's awfully popish. Until someone actually just took the cross and just plunked it on the table, and then that was, like no formal decision was actually taken. Someone just went, boom, and then put it on. But we still deal with the vestiges of iconoclasm as it emerged and sort of waxed and waned this. Here's the thing. How many of you have actually been into an Eastern Orthodox church? What is the one thing that is a feature of Eastern Orthodox churches? Icons. They're everywhere today. So needless to say, this didn't take.
But aren't you, this is what I understand was they're icons, but they're two-dimensional. As long as they're two-dimensional, those counts.
It's kind of hard to say, but certainly the two-dimensional iconography that you see within the Eastern Orthodox churches, ultimately, you see, there were the iconoclasts, the icon breakers, and there were the iconoduals that liked them. Ultimately, the iconoduals were won out, but not without some consultation, because this was about a 57-year ban that this happened. And then we actually get to it again. In 814, iconoclasm comes back again for about the same period of time. It was a struggle, but ultimately, the hitch was this. I don't necessarily. The one thing about this course, and the really hard thing to do, is get into the theological debates on every single point, because that's a rabbit hole. But largely what happened is there was a major crisis externally. There was an existential concern with the rise of Islam. And what did the church do? It does what it does best. Welcome to North America. Everybody started looking at their nails. That's effectively what this was. But you see, this debate over iconoclasm actually did further the tensions between East and West, and because of course the Western Church really supported the use, and I mean it still does, the use of icons, and of course the Eastern Church, of course, there's a uniqueness of the icons in the Eastern Church that they're beautiful. And a lot of that imagery did survive, but this was a major point of debate at a point of weakness in the empire, and therefore in the Byzantine, the Orthodox Church.
Just to clarify, so the 57-year banning,
Yeah.
effective ban on icons, was specific to the Byzantine Empire?
Yes, churches specifically in the Byzantine Empire. The Western Church, even though they were kind of told you need to get rid of the icons, the Pope and said no, no.
And all the Eastern Catholics outside of Byzantine Empire also kept on with icons.
Yeah, they kind of kept on with icons, but there were some. See, there would be. The trouble is, since that time, there's been a whole lot of cross-pollination and things like that. So it's hard to kind of pin it down. But yes, I mean, at this point in time.
I'll ask you later.
Okay, asking me later is just fine.
Yeah.
So. Okay, now let's see where we're at. And of course, this would be much of the debates between the 8th and 9th centuries, because there was that one from 730 to 787, but then there was a second round of iconoclasm again, in 814, and then moving forward almost to the end of the 9th century. But it's created more and more attention, because keep in mind that with the rise of Islam, you have 3 centers of the Pentarchy just eliminated from the conversation. So now you actually had 2 siblings, effectively, the Western Church and the Eastern Church centered. Western Church centered in Rome, Eastern Church centered in Constantinople. The Roman Church had a superiority complex, and actually well deserved, because they didn't have the emperor's thumb on them all the time. And in fact, they were beginning to realize that, hey, we've got more influence than you do. Plus, St. Peter was from Rome, so that's we're the real church, sort of thing. And so this is more and more what's happening. Just coming back to that, that's actually my last official slide, because next week we actually get to the split and what's happening there. We will be dealing with a little bit more in terms of what Christianity looked like under Islam during its golden period as well. So that's, and who was the real church really is more the question for next week. And then the answer is kind of, that was the question they were struggling with. We look at that and kind of say, that's stupid. But it was their question. And so this is the final, and this also sets the stage. Actually, part of today sets the stage for the Crusades, which we'll be getting into the next time we get together in hopefully a warmer environment. But certainly next week, as we actually get to that. And now here's the other thing is, I didn't really get a chance to, I did say that this was going to be a warts and all course. I didn't really get a lot of a chance to get into this. Usually at this point in time, while it is, there's people being executed for heresy really didn't happen a great deal of time. First time it actually happened was in about 385 CE. The so-called burning of the heretics, the first time that happened is actually barely in this time period. It's in Orleans in 1022. And that may be more reflective of the kind of culture that the Frankish culture of the day. Still pretty ugly. But at the same time, this whole Inquisition, heretics, all that kind of stuff is after this. But again, it comes out of questions of identity. I'm not going to excuse it, but and unfortunately, during the Middle Ages, the way they dealt with it was pretty gross. We do get to cover that, of course, when eventually we do the Crusades. So, any other questions and anything that I've left out? Because one of the things, with dealing with such an orbital level course, is that I know I'm leaving out so much more that I'm including. So I'm just hoping to give you an idea of the broadest possible themes with this. Is to say that, especially tonight, my hope was to get you out of the mindset that the Roman Empire fell, the Church rose up in its ashes. And while that is sort of true for the West, it's definitely not true for the East. And yet, it is every bit a part of Christian history. And that Christianity actually continued to have an influence on Islam. And we're going to deal with that a little bit. Because largely we're dealing with the split between the Byzantines and the Byzantine Church and the Roman Church. Because at this point in time, even though Christianity continued to exist and flourish under Islam, maybe not nearly as great, because the closed borders and the open borders didn't really exist. It was a lot harder for those ideas to travel back through, beyond the frontiers between these empires. Clear as mud? Anyway, thank you very much.